The second existentialist philosopher that we will talk about in this lesson is also French, and his name, it is pronounced, his French pronunciation of his first name would be Albert, and his second name is pronounced Camus. Camus. And he is, Camus says, the fundamental philosophical question is whether or not one should commit suicide. Now, behind this question is the concern that a meaningless world might not be worth living in. Camus claims that life is absurd. And this is going to be a big word for him. I'm going to expand upon it here just a little bit. Camus says there is a gap between how we need the world to be to live rational and comfortable lives, to be secure in our lives. There is a gap between how we need the world to be and how the world actually is. A brutish and indifferent natural environment. And Camus refers to this gap as the absurd. So this is a big word for him, and that's what he means by it. The absurd is the gap between how we need the world to be and how the world actually is. Camus claims that true integrity involves acknowledging the absurdity of our situation, yet not surrendering to despair or hope. That's an unusual way to put it. You would not surrender. Hope to Camus is simply escapist. You are not dealing with what is real. So you have not to surrender to either despair or hope. That's true integrity. Suicide, he said, is an act of cowardice. Hope is delusional and escapist and equally cowardly. Camus counsels a continuing defiance or a type of heroic revolt in the face of life's absurdity. His attitude is perhaps best expressed in the myth of Sisyphus, which is the last chapter in a book by the same name. Now, I'll say just a little bit about Sisyphus. Sisyphus is a character in Greek mythology, and the thing that I want to emphasize about him is that he was given a spectacular punishment in the underworld. Okay, and his punishment was, now exactly what his offense was, there are a few different stories on that. We won't worry about that. But Sisyphus was a man who was punished in the underworld by having to roll a boulder up a steep hill, a huge, huge stone. And right when he would get near the top, it would roll back over and come all the way back down to the bottom of that hill. And he would have to go and do that again over and over and over. This was his punishment. To the Greeks, of course, this would have been a nightmare. It would have been all of this effort put towards something that's utterly meaningless. But Camus says something unusual. He says Sisyphus is a model of what he calls the absurd hero or the existential hero. This is from the myth of Sisyphus. The workman of today works every day in his life at the same task, and this fate is no less absurd. Okay. In other words, Sisyphus is kind of a model for all of us. We're all working at tasks that ultimately are meaningless. And Sisyphus acknowledges the absurd, but he doesn't surrender to despair or hope. He defies his fate. And this concludes the myth of Sisyphus. Let me read this. He too concludes that all is well. This is Sisyphus. This universe, henceforth without a master, no God, seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain in itself forms a world. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Now, that's an unusual reading of the myth of Sisyphus, but he would claim that Sisyphus' It's like all of us. Camus would claim we're working at something that is ultimately futile and meaningless, yet he puts all of his energy into it. He does not surrender to despair, and there is actually a type of happiness in living like that. And so Camus sees Sisyphus as a type of absurd hero, or he could be called an existential hero. Camus counsels living as much as possible in the present. That can actually make us grateful for life, and that in itself is a type of happiness.